For years, quad-core chips were the cream of the crop when it came to gaming on Intel's consumer platform. However, since the release of AMD's Ryzen series of chips, we've seen an explosion in the number of cores on consumer platforms, ranging from the measly dual-core up to the monstrous hexadecacore R9-5950X. Looking at the Steam hardware survey though, quite a lot of us gamers are still rocking quad-core chips, with the majority being on the Intel side of things. To cut to the chase though, this review is more of a quad-core CPU checkup video than it is a specific review of this particular processor. One of Intel's most produced CPUs at this point is the Skylake 14nm quad-core, since it's been around on the same microarchitecture for 5 generations at this point. And with me having some history with this chip, I wanted to take a look back on this workhorse quad-core, as it's gone from mainstream to budget chip in just a few short years. Let's begin our look at the i3-8350k, and check out the specs and performance of this ever so popular configuration. Before we get into this video, I'd like to take a moment to say not to forget to leave a like and subscribe, and comment if there's something you think I missed in this video. If there is some information that you feel I should have covered, then commenting or joining the community Discord is one of the best ways to get in touch. I also have a Patreon, where I release scripts for these sorts of videos early. The Patreon actually got the Titan X Pascal review 2 days early, I believe, but any support is appreciated. Now without any further ado, let's take a look at the i3-8350k, and see how this configuration has aged. To start our look at the i3-8350k, let's go into some specifications and see what we're being presented with this quad-core processor. Starting off simple, we've got 4 Skylake derivative cores on a cut-down Coffee Lake die. This means that under the hood we're getting a 126mm piece of silicon, and for what they've managed to squeeze in, it packs a powerful punch. Utilizing Intel's 14nm++ lithographic node, this chip features decent power efficiency with a rated TDP of 91 watts. It is worth noting, however, that overclocking will get that to over 100 watts easily, so unless you've got a decent cooling configuration, be a little careful and be more conservative with your core voltage. This chip is also overclockable on either the Z370 or Z390 chipset. However, given that this chip released alongside the Z370, that platform is slightly more stable, but also is more likely to have less VRMs, meaning the potential energy you can put through your chip is generally higher on the Z390 boards. This helps with overclocking greatly, and when we get into overclocking on this chip, you'll see what I'm talking about. But for now, I'd recommend at least a Z370 chipset if you're planning on picking one of these chips up, as it allows for power headroom and also will allow for more stable memory overclocks. A Z390 board is only really worth buying into if you're rocking an 8-core Coffee Lake R chip, and I'm just speaking from personal experience there. The cache structures found in this chip are nearly identical to the previous generation's i5-7600K, with each core having access to 64 kilobytes of L1 data cache, paired up with a 256 kilobyte block of L2. The final level cache comes in at 8 megabytes total, which is ahead of our cheaper i3-8100 but less than the i5-8400. Overall, the caches are large and should easily keep our 4 cores fed with data, meaning fetching from main memory is slightly less frequent. Either way, when we get to the test later on, we'll be using a 3200 megatransfer kit underclocked to 2666 megatransfers. This is because the memory controller on this i3 is rated for 2666. They're technically overclockable, but running them at 3200 megatransfers caused slight instability. It's not like the system was unusable, but it led to a blue screen that kind of killed a good gaming session. It's just for stability's sake and realistically shouldn't affect performance that much on this particular setup. In terms of the individual cores featured in this processor, we've got derivative Skylake cores, meaning that IPC is identical to the previous and successive 2 generations. However, with 14nm++, Intel made the individual transistors slightly larger, giving the side effect of lower density but allowing for higher clock speeds as a result. Inside the cores, we get 8 execution ports, paired with 72 load ports and 56 store ports. What this means is that 8 instructions can be processed per core per clock cycle, allowing for high levels of parallelism within them. On top of that, the chip features AVX2, meaning that a programmer can crunch many numbers at a time, even further parallelizing the chip. Unfortunately, this chip lacks AVX512, but it does feature an iGPU that's compatible with OpenCL, meaning that we can write kernels to address specific portions of the chip. This iGPU would allow you to have hundreds of threads running at once, meaning you can shade and or modify hundreds of pixels at a time. Rather than running on only 4 strong threads, you can run your core on hundreds of weaker threads within the iGPU. It's only Intel HD 630 graphics, so it's not insanely powerful, but it gets the job done if pixel or image processing is something you do on the daily. In terms of clock speeds, we get a rather high base clock of 4 GHz. Unfortunately, none of the 8th Gen i3s feature turbo boost technology, meaning your clock speed is locked to whatever you set your multiplier to. This simplifies overclocking greatly, but also means your chip can't bump its clocks higher when under stress. With my particular chip, the maximum clock speed attainable was 4.7 GHz stable. I could technically hit 5 GHz, however the stability of the system was rather questionable, so I didn't bother pushing further. At 4.7 GHz, we get roughly 150 million instructions per second under ideal conditions though, which is significantly higher than the last generation of consoles offered in terms of CPU horsepower. This should lead to console killing performance when compared to the Xbox One X and PlayStation 4 Pro, but is now behind when compared to the more modern Xbox Series X and S and PlayStation 5. This chip just can't compete in multi-threaded performance when matched against newer chips from both Intel and AMD, but it still competes rather well in single-threaded given its Skylake core architecture. Overclocking also caused our power consumption to increase by around 20 watts, coming in between 100 to 110 watts, when the chip is stressed. This, when compared to other chips I reviewed, is remarkably efficient, and means you compare this chip with cheaper Z370 boards without worrying about VRM issues. To analyze the performance of the i3-8350k, let's throw it in my newish test bench consisting of an MSI Z390A Pro motherboard paired with 64 gigs of the aforementioned DDR4 3200 megatransfers per second kit that will be running at 2666. This board, while not the highest end piece of kit, has VRMs that would allow our 8350k to maintain its high clock speed under load. My Corsair H115i was used to ensure that thermals weren't limiting us either, and frankly the chip never got above 70C when under 100% load. Along with our 8350k, I've paired it with my overclocked and water-cooled Titan X Pascal, which should keep our tests strictly CPU bound. We'll be running all our tests at 1080p at the lowest settings, which will force our CPU to push out as many frames as possible. I'm not recommending you run a setup like this at home, it's just for testing purposes. Let's get into the benchmarks and check out the performance of the 8350k in context. Let's start off slow and easy with Apex Legends. At the settings and resolution we're testing at, we achieved beyond playable performance, coming in with a minimum of 128 FPS and an average of 144 FPS, hinting that the CPU's single-threaded abilities remain competitive with much newer chips from Intel. Later on when we get to CSGO, you'll see what I'm talking about, but this is the first example of a game not running all that poorly on this hardware, probably due to its use of a modified version of the source engine. Ark Survival Evolved is a massive step backwards in not only performance, but frame rate stability. Realistically, we're still above 60 FPS on average, but compared to Apex Legends, the frame rates just aren't as high. Another thing I think is important to mention is frame rate stability. It's not often talked about, but the stability of your frame rate can have a massive impact on your experience due to the variable input and visual delays. The chip saw massive spikes in CPU render times in this game that seemed to happen at random, but looking back it probably had something to do with the dinosaur AI, which no matter which processor I play on seems to tank performance. It's kind of unavoidable on this processor, and I'd recommend a heavy overclock if you're eyeing one of these chips to play Ark. Battlefield 2042, a game that will probably go down as this generation's Crysis, performed admirably but ultimately very poorly. Even though the average sits at 61 FPS, the game spent a majority of the time below it, and in MSI Afterburner the chip sat pegged at 100% utilization. I wouldn't recommend this particular chip for this game, and instead would recommend one of the newer i3-10100s because of its 8-threaded nature. Even on my i7-11700K, This game only hammers about 8 threads at a time, so the 4 in our 8350K are really struggling here. Call of Duty Vanguard ran better than Battlefield 2042, but behind other competitive FPS games that we're testing today. This game is built on the IW 8.0 engine, which is a modern rebuild of the classic Quake 3 engine-based iteration of the IW engine. As a result, the engine is able to heavily parallelize itself to take advantage of high core count CPUs. However, older hardware such as the 8350K kinda get left behind, and as a result we get performance that, in all honesty, is perfectly adequate, but is ultimately below where I prefer my games to be. Up next is Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and at 1080p, our i3 returned an average of 318 FPS. This is similar to my i9-9900K, which despite having 4 times as many threads available to the game, provides performance that looks nearly identical. CSGO just lacks multi-threaded processing, so we aren't able to take advantage of the extra hardware on the higher-end CPU. This makes the 8350K an awesome CSGO CPU, and I'd recommend checking one out if you're looking to get into some esport gaming on the cheap. CYBERPUNK 2077 actually performed better than I was expecting. Coming in with an average of 86 FPS, this chip provides last-gen console killing performance, and all with half the number of threads. Once again, like ARC, framerate stability was a massive issue though, with occasional pauses in the game for at least half a second as I moved quickly throughout the world. I'm not sure if it's my specific setup, but CYBERPUNK just runs weirdly on this chip, and I wouldn't recommend it for this particular game. Our next game is our first Vulkan showcase. Doom Eternal ran beyond excellently at our test resolution and settings, and there isn't really anything to complain about. I know from a Digital Foundry interview the developers of this game's engine spent a lot of time optimizing CPU multi-threaded processing and CPU code efficiency. Their effort certainly paid off, and it makes for an awesome experience on the 8350K. Gears of War 5, a game that features a CPU-focused portion of the benchmark, returned an average of 165 FPS, which while still playable is far behind chips that are now relatively inexpensive like the i7-10700K, or even newer Rocket Lake i5s. But judged in a vacuum, the 8350K provides excellent performance that allows for a Titan X Pascal to draw tons of frames with even frame pacing. The minimum also came in at 120 FPS, so this game would be playable and enjoyable on a 120Hz display. It's awesome to chainsaw locusts at over 100 FPS, and it's something that everyone should experience at least once in their life. Our first Rage Engine game, Grand Theft Auto V, performed well, but had some stuttering issues shown in the minimums. Admittedly, the stuttering was infrequent, but if you play this game a certain way, you'll run into them more often. Even though it's playable, I'm personally used to playing at a smooth 120 FPS in this game, meaning stepping up to a 6-core processor from the red or blue team. If you've got an 8350K, you'll have a more than enjoyable experience, as this crushes any of the currently available console versions of the game. Halo Infinite performed below my personal expectations. I was expecting the game to get a locked 60 FPS, but unfortunately, as shown in the minimums, this was not achieved. The maximum is oddly high though, indicating that the game can demand lots of CPU resources suddenly, and then suddenly demand much less. It's probably got something to do with the physics in the game, but that's just my personal guess. I honestly expected a bit more from this chip, yet while it is playable, it's suboptimal for most of us who demand 60 FPS from our systems. Overwatch ran at beyond playable frame rates, with a minimum of 177 FPS. This is beyond playable at high refresh rates, and to be honest, this is probably all you need to run this particular game. In fact, the 8350K offers frankly overkill amounts of performance, and I wonder how a cheaper hyper-threaded dual-core Pentium would hold up against the i3 that we've got here. But if you're looking to put together an Overwatch system, then the 8350K would make for an excellent CPU if it's all you play. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, our second Unreal Engine 4 title, ran beyond smoothly at 1080p low settings. With an average of 234 FPS, it's hard to argue with, and the minimums show that this processor could offer locked high refresh rate gaming at a relatively cheap price. However, this game once again seems to be single-threaded bottlenecked, as the performance looks similar but not identical to the much more expensive 9900K. There's more dark silicon on the 9900K though, meaning we're technically getting a much better deal in the price to performance category. QUAKE, a game used to see how many frames can be pushed with using simple geometry, performed with crazy amounts of performance, and if I'm being honest, this level of performance is simply unnecessary. With an over 1700 FPS average, this chip never drops close to the 360Hz mark, meaning that you'd be able to experience the classic shooter at ultra high refresh rates and never see anything resembling current game performance. It's a testament to QUAKE's rather efficient and powerful engine, that while kind of old, provides nice effects work and fun gameplay. Up next is Rainbow Six Siege, another esports shooter game that's been popular ever since its release. The 8350K returned an average of 311 FPS, so once again this game seems to be playable on that chip thanks to the lack of multi-threaded processing. Keep in mind that this game is now nearly 7 years old, and came out in a time where quad cores were still high-end. Today we've got many core processors that provide tons of multi-threaded performance, but not much of a jump in single-threaded performance. This again draws parallels to the 9900K, which provides similar performance due to the lack of single-threaded improvements. Red Dead Redemption 2, our second Rage and Vulkan-based game, ran about where I expected it to. With a minimum of 2 FPS and an average of 79, this game is playable and technically console killing, but it's got some drawbacks. Probably most notable is the fact that we're using the lowest settings, meaning that the CPU has to make less draw calls. These draw calls, while requiring CPU resources to initialize, are then sent to the GPU for processing. The CPU is mostly responsible for the AI, overall detail placement, and geometry processing, but the GPU does most of the heavy lifting graphically. However, this doesn't really help in this case as this game is so complex. It's admittedly kind of hard to run on older hardware, but it runs in a way that I'd be satisfied with to play through the game. Our last game, Call of Duty Warzone, runs on the IW 8.0 engine like Call of Duty Vanguard. However, something that Infinity Ward is doing allows this game to scale much better on the quad-core 8350K. With an average of 120 FPS and a minimum of 68, this game performs where I would feel comfortable playing it. But its performance allows it to feel more competitive than Vanguard, all while providing a larger world and much more sophisticated procedural geometry and detail streaming algorithms. This game runs excellently, and it leaves me comfortable to recommending this chip to play Warzone competitively. Now that we've discussed the benchmarks, let's discuss if the chip is worth buying in 2022, and if so, how much to buy it for. Based on the performance, this chip is actually worth picking up if you're playing older or esport games that were developed when the quad-core was mainstream. However, specifically with games like Battlefield 2042, performance was heavily bottlenecked by only having 4 cores. In terms of single-threaded performance, this chip has it all there, and it's easy to recommend if single-threaded tasks are all you do. However, once something becomes multi-threaded, you'll start seeing massive slowdowns as this chip just can't parallelize enough data. For esport and older titles, this isn't really as important, but for current generation titles, we're starting to see this particular configuration struggle. If you're eyeing up an 8350K, just know that in 2 to 3 years from now, its performance won't be able to keep up with current generation games. But in the here and now, it still performs adequately in said titles. But for a system meant to play older games, this particular chip is astoundingly fast, and in all reality an i5-7600K analog. It clocks similarly, has the same cache structures, and features an identical core architecture. For all intents and purposes, this is an i5 of old, and is a relic of Intel's history where they were transitioning from quad-core high-end to the monstrous 8 cores that we see today. Its performance is beyond competitive with the 6th and 7th gen i5s, but compared to modern i3s, specifically the i3-10100, its performance is beyond competitive with 6th and 7th gen i5s, but compared to modern i3s, specifically the i3-10100, its multi-threaded performance falls behind, and is left in the dust by the aforementioned 10th gen i3. On its own, this chip may no longer be the budget king it once was, but for the right price it can make a great start to your build. On eBay this chip is going for around $120, which in my opinion is entirely too expensive given that the 10100 goes for the same price. On top of that, the LGA 1151 socket maxes out at 8 cores and 16 threads with the i9-9900K. LGA 1200, however, like what's found on the 10th and 11th gen parts, supports all the way up to 10 cores and 20 threads. If future-proofing is a concern, I'd once again recommend the LGA 1200 i3, as it will provide you with a better upgrade path, especially given 10th gen i5s are now so cheap. Though if you can find one for under $100, then it's a bargain, and would make for a great start to a budget gaming rig. Just be aware of some of the downsides of the chip, which include its overall lack of multi-threaded prowess and limited socket upgrade path. On its own though, I would happily recommend the i3-8350k if you're trying to get an esport machine going, and you find one on the cheap. I sure know that I had one hell of a time with this chip. Thank you i3-8350k. You made my childhood awesome.